That's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at who has the power when it comes to certain things like delegated, reserved, or concurrent. So we're going to look at who has power and maybe who doesn't have power. So we're going to look at some state things. We're going to look at some federal things. We're going to look at things that they share. And then we're going to look at how the government actually gives itself the ability to kind of change with time. So this is going back to federalism and flexibility, those two principles that we covered earlier. So the first thing we're going to look at is delegated powers. So delegated powers are also known as enumerated, expressed, explicit, or written. So a delegated power is in the Constitution, and it's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And remember, Article 1 sets up what branch? The legislative branch. So some things are actually written and they are given only to the federal government, and that is to clear up issues that could happen if you let states do some stuff. So one of those that only the federal government has the power to do is to negotiate, deal with treaties. Treaties are agreements between the United States and another country, like England, France, Germany, Japan, whatever other countries out there, okay? So sometimes our government makes treaties to end wars. Sometimes it's like treaties about dealing with particular issues we've been having. The person who is going to negotiate the treaties is going to be the president. So the president has the ability to negotiate treaties. But remember, when we looked at principles, his ability to sign on those treaties is going to be checked and balanced by the Senate. So he's the executive, the legislative, the Senate is going to check it. So the president can negotiate treaties all he wants, but it's going to take the senators, that 100 group, to go ahead and agree that this is what is best for the United States. So I kind of always use the example of the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson goes out there, he's negotiating the end of the United States involvement in World War I, and there's a lot of political stuff that goes on, but at the end of the day, the United States Senate refuses to recognize the treaty. They won't sign off on it. So we don't sign the Treaty of Versailles. We do a different treaty later on that ends our involvement. So when a president and the government are doing these things, they're still kind of checking each other and they're still regulating each other. Okay. Another thing that our government actually gets to do is issue money. And this is all because of that whole like Articles of Confederation thing. So long time ago, our first government, every state had its own money system. So when you went from North Carolina to Virginia, it was basically like you were leaving kind of a country and going to have to exchange your money somewhere else. Okay? So if you leave the United States today and you go to Canada, you might have to exchange your money if the place doesn't take U.S. currency. Okay? This is our currency. This is our money. So what we decided to do is we were just going to have a U.S. dollar. Instead of it being like each state kind of acted on its own like they did under the Articles, what we're now going to do is we're going to have one united U.S. dollar. And so it makes trading, it makes dealing with businesses a lot easier. So we trade all the time within the country. It makes it easier. Now when you trade with foreign countries, that too is going to be regulated by the federal government. That's one of their powers that they regulate. But we all have the same dollar, and this helps out the government when it comes to regulating the interstate and foreign trade. Okay. So the U.S. government regulates anything that deals with us and foreign countries. And that's because if you had states doing it, it would be a nightmare. There's 50 states. It's too much for the states to start regulating like foreign countries. So we just let the federal government do it. And remember, I kind of explained like the federal government is kind of like the parent of the states. The parent is, at the end of the day, supposed to be making the decisions that is what's best for the entire family. Because if you let kids make decisions, kids are going to make the decision of what's best for them, and not the whole family. So when the federal government makes their interstate and foreign trade agreements, they're making agreements that is best for the entire country. Remember, interstate, think about like I-95, Interstate 95. It connects New York all the way down to Florida, across a lot of state lines. Anything that's dealing with a federal government zone. Okay? Same thing when you're crossing country lines. Like when you're trading with Mexico or Canada, like with NAFTA, that's going to be federal government zone. The federal government also has the ability to declare war. So again, we don't want the states to have that ability because it would be too much. So we're going to let only the federal government have that ability to declare war. So when the president wants war, he has to ask Congress for permission. Congress will either agree or not agree. It's based on what we, the American people, feel. But they will give the president the go-ahead for war. Okay, so like World War II, FDR, the president, asked for a declaration of war, and Congress gave it to him. The U.S. government also has the ability to maintain a military. So this is where defense spending and all that goes into. So you can't have soldiers without having equipment for our soldiers. So that's a power that only the U.S. federal national government has. That's why they're the U.S. Army. They also have the ability to amend the Constitution. Now, we've got some, say in this, but amending the Constitution is something the federal government's allowed to do. They work with the states to get it done, but this is actually a delegated power. So remember, when we talk about amending the Constitution, we're talking about changing the Constitution. The next power that we look at is reserved. So reserved powers are anything that is not given to the national government. It's going to go to the states. And this is in that 10th Amendment, a part of our Bill of Rights. So if it's not explicitly written for the federal government, the national government, it goes to the individual states. Things that you guys know firsthand, like education. So education is not really given to the federal government. Now they do oversee parts of education, but really, at the end of the day, it's your state that actually regulates and does everything with education. So states have different requirements. So some of you are military kids. You've come from a different state where they have different courses and different requirements. So when you come to North Carolina, you might have to repeat a class because you get a high school diploma from North Carolina. Now, the U.S. government has education schools too. They're called DOD, our Department of Defense schools. That's fine. See, that's for the military kids who live on base. That's different. Okay. But states pretty much do their own education system. Now, they follow federal guidelines, particularly if they take federal money. So if you took Common Core money, you have to follow Common Core. Now, you can reject it, like Ohio did, but that means you don't get the money for the program. And so when you don't take the money, you're going to as a state, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to do that. Because education is expensive. So the government of your state also has the power to grant licenses. That can be a driver's license, marriage licenses, gun licenses, any licenses. So fishing, hunting, those are all licenses issued by your state, and they determine like qualifications as long as they follow federal standards on stuff. Okay. Same thing with police and fire department. So your state will provide for police and fire protection. And remember, we talked about like the city versus county. Those are local governments, but they are in the state of North Carolina, so they are providing police and fire. So Fayetteville, your Fayetteville PD, every single night, they got their 9 p.m. routine on Twitter and on all their other social media platforms. But that is something that the state is allowed to provide for you and me to keep us safe. Okay. And remember what I told you with like law enforcement. Most of your day-to-day law enforcement is not going to be federal. It's really going to be done by your city, your state. Okay. They also get to regulate the sale of property within the state. So if you ever wanted to be a real estate agent or a broker, real estate broker, you would have to actually pass the North Carolina test to be that. And that's a license too. Okay. So like I'm a teacher, I have a North Carolina license. Same thing with like hairdressers. They have to have a North Carolina license. So licenses are like doctor's licenses, pharmacists, all that. Those are licenses that your state grants. Same thing with that real estate. So you have to know those laws. So every state's got different laws on the sale of property within the state, and that's why real estate agents have to take those tests. And if they move to another state, they'd have to take that test as well so that their license would be good. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is like conducting elections. So your states all conduct elections. So you have a state board of elections and you have local board of elections. So you have the state North Carolina board of elections, then you have Cumberland County board of elections. So states run elections, they conduct them. They report the findings to the federal government. They make the ballots, they report all that stuff. That's them that does it. The next thing that states get to do is they get to ratify amendments to the Constitution. So I told you that the delegated power to amend the Constitution is a national federal power, but it goes to the states for them to agree to the change. So once the states, enough of them have agreed, then it can actually go as an official change, an official amendment to the United States Constitution. States also have the power to regulate intra-state trade. So intra is within your state. Okay. So within your state would be like things like highway, So anything that happens in the state of North Carolina that just deals with us is going to be intrastate trade. The state governments also have to take measures for public health and safety. So this is why you have departments of human health and services in your states. So they follow federal stuff on that, but they do have their own programs and stuff that they are looking at. All right, so the next thing that we're going to look at is concurrent powers. What a concurrent power is anything that the federal government, the national government, and states share. So they both have this, they're both sharing this. Like spending money. North Carolina and the U.S. government spends money. They spend your tax money, and that's why they get to levy taxes. So we pay taxes to all of the different levels of government, state, local, and your federal government, and they are using that money to provide you and me with services like criminal punishment, courts, okay? So when we pay our taxes to the state of North Carolina and we pay our taxes to the federal government, they are using our money to do kind of all these things, like how to run it. Okay, how do you run the government? So both of them, federal and state, have crimes. They've cleared up what the crime is, clear definition, and they have punishments established to it. But like I told you guys, you still have to follow like federal standards as a punishment for the states. So like we talked about with the death penalty, you can't give the death penalty for any old thing because there's a regulation on that. It has to be for like murder, first degree murder kind of cases. A life for a life. The federal government and your states have courts. And you actually have more than just federal, state. You have like your local kind of stuff too, okay? So your local court would be your district, your superior court. So you have a district court in Cumberland County and you have a superior court. Then you have, of course, the state courts, like the State Court of Appeals. You have the Supreme Court here in North Carolina. And then you have your federal court system too. And most state courts and federal courts, they're pretty much alike. They mirror each other. States and the federal government get to define voter qualifications. And this is how, like when we looked at some of that racist